The crystal halls of the Galactic Concord stretched upward like frozen dreams, their walls humming with energy that had powered an empire for 12,000 years. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked through these halls with her head held high. Though her heart beat fast beneath her diplomatic uniform, her daughter Mira, only 7 years old, held tight to her mother's hand and looked around with wide, curious eyes at the alien wonders surrounding them. This was supposed to be humanity's greatest moment after 2 centuries of space travel. After countless struggles to reach the stars, they had finally been invited to meet the rulers of the galaxy. The Galactic Concord controlled 10,000 worlds and had watched over countless species since before humans had learned to make fire. Elena had prepared for this day her entire life. She had studied every known language, every custom, every law of the Concord. She had brought her family because the Concord valued unity and harmony. And what better symbol of peace than a mother with her child, her husband David, waited aboard their ship with their infant son Marcus, ready to join them once the formal introductions were complete. The chamber of the adjudicators was vast beyond imagination. 3 beings of pure light floated at its center, their forms shifting between geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. These were the judges of the galaxy, the beings who decided which civilizations would flourish and which would be erased for the good of cosmic harmony. Around them floated hundreds of observers from different species, their strange bodies and stranger eyes all fixed on the small human delegation. Elena felt like an ant standing the 4 giants, but she did not let her fear show. She stepped forward and began her prepared speech about humanity's hopes for friendship and cooperation. The adjudicators listened in perfect silence when she finished. The chamber remained quiet for a long moment. Then the first adjudicator spoke, its voice echoing from everywhere at once. "We have analyzed your species thoroughly," it said. "We have studied your genetics, your history, your behavioral patterns." Elena nodded, expecting this. The Concord was known for their careful evaluation of new species. "We have found your species acceptable for provisional membership," the adjudicator continued. "However, there is a matter that must be addressed first." The light in the chamber shifted, and suddenly a beam focused on little Myra. The girl squeezed her mother's hand tighter. "This child," the second adjudicator said, "carries genetic markers that indicate a high probability of aggressive behavior." Elena's blood turned to ice. "Our analysis shows a 94.7% chance that this individual will engage in violence during her lifetime," the third adjudicator added. "This is unacceptable for the harmony of the Concord. She is 7 years old," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "She has never hurt anyone in her life. Probability does not require past action," the first adjudicator replied. "We judge potential, not history, and this child's potential is contaminated." The observers in the chamber murmured among themselves. Elena saw no sympathy in any of their alien faces. "The family unit is hereby condemned," the adjudicators announced together, their voices merging into one terrible sound. "The child will be taken for cognitive restructuring to remove aggressive tendencies, and the parents will be terminated to prevent further genetic contamination." "No," Elena whispered, "sentence will be carried out immediately." Everything happened in the span of 3 heartbeats. Elena saw the execution beam forming. In the air above them, she saw the Concord guards moving to grab Myra. She saw her daughters face twist with confusion and fear, and in that moment, Ambassador Elena Vasquez disappeared. In her place stood something older, something that had survived ice ages and plagues, and wars beyond counting. She threw herself over Myra just as the beam fired. The blast hit her left arm, and the pain was beyond anything she had ever imagined. She felt her flesh burn, and her bones shatter, and her nerves scream in agony. But she did not cry out. She wrapped her remaining arm around her daughter, and looked up at the adjudicators, with eyes that held no tears, only cold. "Absolute promise. You will regret this," she said, her voice steady despite the blood pooling beneath her. The adjudicators tilted their geometric forms in what might have been confusion. "Regret is an inefficient emotion," one of them said. "We do not experience it. You will learn." Elena replied. The guards pulled Myra from her arms while the girl screamed for her mother. They dragged Elena away, leaving a trail of blood on the crystal floor. The observers watched with mild interest, as if this was nothing more than routine business, and for them, it was the Concord had judged thousands of species over the millennia. They had culled billions of individuals deemed unfit for harmony. This was simply how the galaxy worked. But as they took Elena to a cell and left her to bleed, none of them noticed the small device hidden in her diplomatic badge. It had been recording everything, and it was still transmitting aboard the human ship. Commander David Vasquez watched the feed in horrified silence. He saw his wife lose her arm. He saw his daughter dragged away screaming. He saw the beings who ruled the galaxy condemn his family with the same emotion one might use to swat an insect. His hands did not shake. His eyes did not water. He simply sat very, very still. The ship's communications officer approached him carefully. "Afraid to speak, sir," she finally said. "What do we do?" David Vasquez looked at her, and she stepped back involuntarily. She had served with him for 5 years and had never seen that look in his eyes. It was not anger. It was hot and fast and burned itself out. This was something else entirely. This was cold. This was patient. This was the look of a man who had just decided that an empire would fall. "Send a message to Earth," he said, his voice perfectly calm. "Use the old frequency, the one from the Unification Wars." The officer's face went pale. That frequency had not been used in 80 years. It was reserved for one thing only. "Sir, are you certain?" "They took my wife's arm," David said. "They took my daughter, and they laughed, so yes, I am certain." He turned back to the view screen where the Concord's capital world hung in space, beautiful and ancient and utterly unaware of what was coming. "Tell Earth that humanity has been judged," he said. "Tell them that our children have been condemned, and tell them that we remember." The message went out across the stars and on 10,000 human colonies, on ships and stations and outposts scattered across the frontier. Humans stopped what they were doing. They read the message. They watched the footage, and one by one, they went silent. The Galactic Concord noticed the sudden quiet from the human settlements. They noted it in their records with mild curiosity. Primitive species often went quiet when confronted with the reality of Concord justice. It was nothing to worry about. The humans would accept their place eventually. They all did. But the Concord had made an error in their calculations. They had MEASURED human capability. They had analyzed human technology. They had evaluated human military strength, and they had concluded correctly that humanity posed no threat. What they had not measured was human memory. What they had not analyzed was human spite. What they had not evaluated was what humans became when someone hurt their children. The silence spreading across human space was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of preparation. It was the silence that came before the storm, and somewhere in a cell on the Concord's capital world, Elena Vasquez smiled through her pain, because she knew her husband, she knew her people, and she knew that the adjudicators had just made the worst mistake in their 12,000 years of existence. They had given humanity a reason to remember what they truly were. The package arrived aboard a Concord courier ship 26 hours after the Judgment Commander David Vasquez stood in the cargo bay of his vessel and stared at the small container that had been delivered with official Concorde seals. His crew stood behind him in complete silence. They already knew what was inside. The Concorde had sent a message along with the package, explaining that this was standard procedure for condemned family units. The genetic material of terminated individuals was preserved and returned to their species as a courtesy. David opened the container with steady hands. Inside, preserved in clear fluid, was his wife's arm. It had been severed cleanly by the execution beam. Every finger still perfect, her wedding ring still on her finger. A small note accompanied it, written in the cold, precise language of Concorde bureaucracy. Item: left upper limb of human female, designated Elena Vasquez. Returned as per Protocol 447 regarding terminated individuals. And note that the primary subject survived initial termination attempt due to unexpected biological resilience. Secondary termination has been scheduled for the next lunar cycle. David. Read the note 3 times. His wife was still alive, wounded, imprisoned, scheduled for death, but alive, and his daughter was somewhere in that alien city, being prepared for something called cognitive restructuring. He had looked up what that meant. It was a process where they would cut into her mind and remove everything that made her who she was. They would erase her memories, her personality, her love for her parents. They would turn his bright, curious daughter into an empty shell programmed to serve the Concorde's definition of harmony. David closed the container and handed it to his medical officer. "Preserve this," he said. "We will reattach it when we get her back." The medical officer nodded and carried the container away with trembling hands. David walked to the bridge of his ship, where his remaining crew waited for orders. His infant son, Marcus, slept peacefully in a crib near the captain's chair, unaware that his mother was dying and his sister was being erased. David sat down and activated the communication system. "This is Commander David Vasquez of the diplomatic vessel Hope of Terra," he said. "I am broadcasting on the emergency frequency, reserved for extinction-level threats to humanity." He paused and looked at the stars outside his window. 26 hours ago, the Galactic Concorde judged my family and found them unworthy of existence, and my wife lost her arm protecting our daughter, and she is now imprisoned and scheduled for execution, while my daughter has been taken for cognitive restructuring, which means they will destroy her mind and rebuild her as a slave. His voice remained perfectly calm. The Concorde did this because they calculated that my 7-year-old daughter might become violent someday, and they decided that the appropriate response was to mutilate my wife and erase my child's soul. And they did this while laughing at us. He transmitted the footage from Elena's badge, showing everything that had happened in the crystal chamber. "I am not asking for rescue," David continued. "I am not asking for negotiation, and I am not asking for justice, because the Concorde does not understand those concepts." He leaned forward. "I am asking humanity to remember. So remember the ice ages when we should have died but refused. And remember the plagues that killed half our species while the survivors buried their dead and kept going. And remember the wars we fought against ourselves, the terrible wars that should have ended us forever. And remember how we always came back." His eyes were dry, his hands were steady, his voice was ice. "The Concorde has ruled this galaxy for 12,000 years. And they have judged countless species, and they have never faced consequences, because no one has ever been strong enough or angry enough or stubborn enough to make them pay." He smiled, and it was not a human smile. "We are going to change that." The message ended, and silence fell across human space on Earth. In cities and villages and farms and factories, people stopped what they were doing. They watched the footage of a mother throwing herself over her child. They saw the blood on the crystal floor. They heard the Concorde's cold judgment, and something very old woke up inside them. It was the thing that had driven their ancestors to cross frozen wastelands in search of food. It was the thing that had made them build walls against the darkness and sharpen stones into weapons. It was the thing that whispered in their blood, passed down through a million years of survival against impossible odds. You do not touch our children within hours. The governments of Earth had convened an emergency session. There was no debate, there was no argument, there was no politics. For the first time in human history, every nation on Earth spoke with one voice. We stand with the Vasquez family. But words were not enough. Words had never been enough. Deep beneath the mountains of Switzerland, in a bunker that had survived 3 world wars and 2 asteroid impacts, the Assembly of Last Resort gathered for the first time in 80 years. These were not politicians or diplomats. These were the keepers of humanity's darkest secrets, the guardians of weapons so terrible that they had been sealed away in the hope that they would never be needed. Admiral Chen Wei, the oldest human to have served in the early contact wars, stood before them. She was 147 years old, kept alive by technology that bordered on magic, and she had seen things that would drive most humans mad, but she had never seen anything like the look in the eyes of the people gathered in that bunker. We always knew this day might come, she said. We hoped it would not, and we prayed that we could join the galactic community in peace. But we prepared for the alternative. She activated a holographic display that showed schematics for projects that had been classified at the highest levels. Project Prometheus, she said, a weapon that converts matter directly into energy with an efficiency that makes nuclear bombs look like fireworks. The display shifted. Project Fenrir, a fleet of autonomous warships that can be built in months instead of years, crewed by artificial minds that do not fear death. Another shift. Project Lazarus, a medical program that can rebuild a human body from almost nothing, that can take a dying soldier and return them to the fight within hours. She looked at the assembled leaders. These projects were sealed because we believed that humanity could be better, that we could rise above our violent nature and join the stars as peaceful explorers. But we were wrong. Her voice hardened. We were not wrong about our potential for peace, because we do have that potential, and we have proven it time and time again. But we were wrong to think that peace meant weakness, and we were wrong to think that the galaxy would respect kindness. She pointed at the display showing Elena's severed arm. They took a mother's arm because she protected her child, and they are going to erase a little girl's mind because she might be dangerous someday. And they are going to execute a woman whose only crime was loving her family. Admiral Chen Wei had lived through horrors beyond imagining. She had watched friends die in the vacuum of space. She had ordered attacks that killed thousands, but her voice cracked when she spoke her next words. They hurt our children. The room was silent. So we are going to hurt them back. And we are going to hurt them so badly that in 12,000 years, their descendants will still tell stories about what happens when you touch a human child. The vote was unanimous. The seals were broken, and humanity began to build in the silence of space. Human colonies went dark, not because they had surrendered. They went dark because they were working. Every factory, every shipyard, every laboratory turned to a single-purpose ships that should have taken decades to build were completed in months. Weapons that should have been impossible were made real, and volunteers lined up by the millions. Not because they were ordered, but because they remembered. They remembered a mother's arm in a box. They remembered a little girl screaming for her parents. They remembered the cold voice of the adjudicators saying that humanity was acceptable except for the parts that were human. The Concorde watched the silence from human space with mild interest. There, analysts concluded that the primitive species was experiencing a collective psychological trauma and would eventually accept their place in the galactic order. They had seen this pattern before. Every species resisted at first. Every species eventually submitted. But the Concorde had never judged humanity before. They did not know that humans did not submit. They did not know that humans remembered. They did not know that somewhere in the dark between stars, a fleet was being born. A fleet built on fury, a fleet powered by spite, a fleet that carried the cold promise of a wounded mother and the steady hands of a father who had held his wife's severed arm. The storm was coming, and the galaxy was not ready. 8 months had passed since the judgment, and the galaxy had forgotten about the small human family condemned in the crystal chamber. The Concord had more important matters to attend to. Trade disputes between member species needed mediation, and new worlds required evaluation for colonization. And the endless bureaucracy of a 10,000 world empire continued its slow grinding progress. The adjudicators had already moved on to judging other species, other families, other children whose genetic markers showed unacceptable probabilities. It was simply how things worked. Elena Vasquez lay in her cell and counted the days on the wall with a sharp stone she had found in her food. She had stopped bleeding months ago, and the Concord doctors had attached a crude mechanical arm to her shoulder so she could feed herself. They did not do this out of kindness. They did it because watching a prisoner struggle to eat with one arm was inefficient. Elena exercised every day, pushing her body to its limits. Despite the pain, she had lost weight and muscle, but her eyes had only grown sharper. The guards who brought her food had stopped looking into those eyes. Something in them made even the armored soldiers of the Concord uncomfortable. She asked about her daughter every day. The guards never answered, but Elena knew that Mira was still alive somewhere. In the facility, she could feel it in her bones. That connection between mother and child that no alien science could measure or understand. Mira was alive, and Mira was fighting. Elena had taught her daughter, while you never give up, you never stop fighting, and you never forget who you are. In the restructuring center 3 levels below Elena's cell, Myra Vasquez sat in a white room and refused to speak. The Concord psychologists had tried everything. They had used gentle persuasion and harsh punishment. They had offered rewards and threatened consequences. They had shown her images designed to break down her sense of identity. But the 7-year-old girl, now 8 after months of captivity, simply looked at them with her father's steady gaze and said nothing. The lead psychologist, a being with too many eyes and not enough compassion, wrote in his report that the human child was exhibiting unprecedented resistance to cognitive restructuring. Her neural patterns refused to accept modification, he noted. Every time we attempt to overwrite her personality matrix, her brain creates new pathways that restore the original configuration within hours. As if her very biology is fighting against our technology, he recommended more aggressive procedures, but deep down, in a part of his alien mind that he would never acknowledge, he was afraid of the little girl who would not break far away from the Concord's capital. In the dark spaces between stars, where no sensors reached, humanity was finishing its work. The shipyards hidden in asteroid fields and gas giant moons had produced something that should not have been possible. 3,000 warships hung in the void, their hulls black as the space around them, their weapon systems unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. These were not elegant vessels designed for efficiency and harmony. These were ugly, brutal machines built for one purpose only. Destruction. Admiral Chun Wei stood on the bridge of the flagship, a massive dreadnought named Remembrance, and reviewed the fleet's readiness. Reports. Every ship was crewed by volunteers who had watched the footage of Elena losing her arm. Every weapon system had been tested and retested until the engineering teams collapsed from exhaustion. Every pilot had trained for this mission, knowing that they might not survive, and behind the fleet, moving slowly on massive engines that burned with the light of captured stars, came something else. It was called the Grudge. It was not a ship. It was a statement. The Grudge was the size of a small moon, built around a core of antimatter so dense that had warped space around it. A single detonation would sterilize a planet. A full discharge would crack a world in half. The scientists who designed it had wept when they finished. They had created the most terrible weapon in human history. And they had done it in 8 months because a little girl was screaming for her mother. Commander David Vasquez stood beside Admiral Chine Wei, his infant son, now old enough to walk, cared for by the ship's crew while his father prepared for war. David had not slept more than 4 hours a night since the judgment. He had spent every waking moment studying the Concorde's defenses, looking for weaknesses, planning approaches. He had become something harder than the man who had held his wife's hand at their wedding. But when he looked at Marcus toddling across the bridge, something soft still flickered in his eyes. He was doing this for his son. He was doing this so Marcus would grow up in a galaxy that knew better than to touch human children. The fleet is ready, Admiral Chun Wei said. We can launch within the hour. David nodded. What are our chances? He asked. The Admiral was quiet for a moment. Honestly, not good, because the Concorde has the largest military force in the galaxy, and their technology is thousands of years ahead of ours, and even with our new weapons, we will be outnumbered 100 to 1. She turned to face him. We will lose ships, and we will lose people, and we might lose everything, but we might win, David said. Yes, because we have something they have never faced before. And we have humans who are willing to die rather than surrender. David thought about his wife in her cell. He thought about his daughter refusing to break. He thought about the arm in the container, still preserved, waiting to be returned to its owner. Then we launch, he said. The order went out across the fleet. 3,000 ships activated their engines and began the journey to the Concorde's capital behind them. The grudge followed like death itself on Earth. People gathered in public squares to watch the fleet depart on massive screens. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They simply stood in silence and watched their children fly toward a battle that might end their species. But no one called for the fleet to turn back. No one demanded peace at any price, because every human watching those screens was thinking the same thing. What if it had been my child? What if it had been my family? What would I do? And they knew the answer. They would burn the galaxy to ash before they let anyone hurt their children. The Concorde detected the human fleet when it was 3 days from the capital. At first, their sensors could not make sense of what they were seeing. The numbers were impossible. Humanity had barely a dozen ships when they first made contact. Now they had thousands. Analysts scrambled to understand how this had happened. Admirals demanded explanations from intelligence officers who had no explanations to give. The adjudicators, for the first time in memory, interrupted their judgment proceedings to review the data. This is not possible, one of them said. The humans do not have the industrial capacity for this level of production. And yet, another replied, the fleet exists. They studied the approaching armada, their ancient minds calculating trajectories and weapons yields and probable outcomes. We can defeat them. The third adjudicator concluded. Our forces are still superior in numbers and technology, and we will lose ships, but we will win. Then there is nothing to fear. The first said, but there was something in the data that troubled them, something they could not quite identify. The human ships were not flying in efficient formations. They were not using optimal approach vectors. They were coming straight at the capital in a pattern that made no tactical sense, unless they did not care about survival, unless they had built their fleet not to win, but to make the Concorde pay. The adjudicators looked at each other, and for the first time in 12,000 years, they felt something unfamiliar. It was not fear. Exactly, it was the recognition that they had miscalculated. They had judged humanity by the same standards they used for every species. They had measured capability and concluded that the humans were weak, but they had not measured will. They had not measured spite, and they had not measured the cold fury of parents whose children had been taken. The storm was 3 days away, and the Concorde was finally beginning to understand what was coming. The Concorde's capital world had never seen anything like this. A single human shuttle descended through the atmosphere, broadcasting no threats, carrying no weapons, requesting only permission to retrieve the condemned. The shuttle carried one man, one infant, and one message. Commander David Vasquez stepped onto the landing platform with Marcus in his arms and looked up at the crystal spires of the alien city. Guards surrounded him immediately, their weapons trained on his chest. But he did not flinch. He had come too far to be afraid. "I'm here for my family," he said simply. The guards looked at each other in confusion. This human had walked into the heart of their empire with a baby and no protection. Either he was insane or he knew something they did not. They escorted him through the crystal halls to the Tavoli did not. Chamber of the Adjudicators? The same chamber where Elena had lost her arm 8 months ago. The same chamber where his daughter had been condemned for crimes she might commit someday. David stood in the center of the room and faced the beings of light who had destroyed his family. "You have come to beg," the first adjudicator said. "This is expected behavior from primitive species." "No," David replied. "I have come to give you a choice." The adjudicators flickered with what might have been amusement. "You are in no position to offer choices." "Human, I disagree." David shifted Marcus to his other arm and pulled out a small communication device. "Before we continue, I would like to see my wife and daughter, because I want to make sure they are still alive." The adjudicators considered this request. There was no harm in showing him his condemned family. It might even break his spirit and make him more cooperative. They ordered the guards to bring the prisoners. Elena Vasquez walked into the chamber with her head held high. Her body was thinner than David remembered, her mechanical arm crude and ugly. But her eyes burned with the same fire he had fallen in love with years ago. She saw him and Marcus, and for just a moment, her face softened. Then she saw where they were, and her expression hardened again. "David," she said, "what are you doing here?" "Getting you back," he replied. Mira came next, escorted by 2 guards who kept their distance from her, as if she were dangerous. The little girl had grown in the months of her captivity, her face thinner, her eyes older than any 8-year-old's eyes should be. But when she saw her father, something cracked open inside her. "Daddy," she whispered. "Hello, sweetheart," David said, and his voice almost broke. He held it together because he needed to be strong for just a little longer. "How touching," one of the adjudicators said. "The family unit is reunited for its final moments together." "About that," David said, and he activated his communication device. Every screen in the capital city flickered. Every display on every ship in orbit changed to show the same image. The human fleet emerged from fold space. 3,000 ships appeared in the sky above the Concorde's capital world, their weapons charged and ready. But that was not what made the adjudicators freeze in their geometric forms behind the fleet. Blocking out the stars themselves came the Grudge. The moon-sized weapon hung in space like a promise of ending, its surface bristling with devices that made the Concorde's sensors scream with warnings. "That," David said softly, "is the result of 8 months of work by every human being who saw what you did to my wife." He looked at the adjudicators with eyes as cold as the void between galaxies. "It contains enough antimatter to turn your capital world into scattered atoms. And it will fire in exactly 1 hour unless my family walks out of here with me." The chamber erupted in chaos. Guards raised their weapons. Officials screamed orders. The adjudicators pulsed with colors that indicated extreme calculation. "You are bluffing," one of them finally said. "The detonation would destroy your fleet as well." "Yes," David agreed. "We know, because we did the math, and we will lose approximately 70% of our ships in the blast. Possibly more, possibly all of them." He smiled. And it was not a kind smile. Do you want to know the interesting part of that calculation? The adjudicators waited. Every single crew member volunteered. And when we told them the survival odds, they asked when they could leave. And when we explained that success meant their deaths, they said they would consider it an honor. He let that sink in. You have spent 12,000 years judging species based on probability and potential. And you have never met a species like us, because we are not rational. And we do not calculate acceptable losses, and we do not optimize for survival. He looked at his daughter, still held by the guards. We optimize for making sure that anyone who hurts our children never forgets the consequences. The first adjudicator moved closer, its form shifting rapidly. "This is madness," it said. "You would sacrifice your entire fleet, your entire species perhaps, for one family." "Yes. Why?" David looked at Elena. At the arm she had lost protecting their daughter, he looked at Myra. At the strength she had shown in 8 months of captivity, he looked at Marcus. Innocent and unaware of the war being fought for his future, because that is what humans do, he said. "We are pack animals, and we protect our pack. And we will fight to the death for the people we love." He turned back to the adjudicators. "You judged my daughter because your algorithm said she might be violent someday. And you were right, because she comes from a violent species. From a species that has fought and killed and conquered since before we learned to walk upright." His voice grew colder. "But here is what your algorithms missed. Because we do not fight without reason, and we do not kill without cause. And we save our violence for one thing above all others." "What thing?" the adjudicator asked. "Protecting our families." David looked at the timer on his device. "You have 53 minutes to decide. And you can fight us, and you might even win. But you will lose this world, and these adjudicators in every ship in orbit. And you will lose them to a species you dismissed as primitive." He sat down on the crystal floor, still holding Marcus. "Or you can let my family go. And we will leave. And we will remember this day. And we will make sure the galaxy remembers it too." The adjudicators communicated silently. With each other, they had ruled for 12,000 years by being calculating and logical and ruthless. They had never faced an opponent who was willing to lose. Everything to prove a point. Their calculations showed that they could destroy the human fleet. Their calculations showed that they would survive as a species, even if the capital fell. But their calculations also showed something else. If they destroyed the human fleet today, more would come tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because humans did not forget, and humans did not forgive. And humans would spend the rest of their existence as a species trying to destroy the Concord if their family was executed today. The math was simple. One family was not worth an eternal war. "Release the prisoners," the first adjudicator said. Finally, the guards hesitated. "Release them now." The guards let go of Myra, who ran to her father and threw her arms around him. Elena walked over and knelt beside them, her mechanical arm whirring as she wrapped it around her daughter. For one moment, the Vasquez family was together again. Whole alive, David stood up with Marcus and took Elena's hand. "We are going to leave now," he said to the adjudicators, "and you are going to watch us go. And you are going to think very carefully about what you have learned today." The adjudicators said nothing. There was nothing to say. The human family walked out of the chamber, through the crystal halls, back to their shuttle. They did not run, they did not hurry. They walked like people who had all the time in the world, because they had won and everyone watching knew it. As the shuttle lifted off and rejoined the fleet, as the Grudge slowly powered down its weapons, as 3,000 human ships turned and began the journey home, a message went out across the galaxy. The human family has been released, and the sentence has been revoked. And the Galactic Concord formally apologizes for any inconvenience caused. It was a lie. Of course, the Concord was not sorry, but they were afraid, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the galaxy began to wonder if maybe the adjudicators were not as powerful as they seemed. 10 years had passed since the day humanity pointed a weapon at the heart of the Galactic Concord and demanded their family back. 10 years since the adjudicators had been forced to retreat for the first time in their ancient existence. 10 years since the galaxy learned to fear a species they had once dismissed as primitive, and everything had changed. Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of her flagship, the UHSS Defiance, and watched as another world voted to leave the Concord. Her mechanical arm had been replaced long ago with something better, something human-designed that responded to her thoughts as naturally as flesh and bone. She never covered it. She wanted everyone to see what the Concord had taken from her and what humanity had built in response. The scars on her shoulder where the arm connected were visible beneath her uniform, a reminder of the price she had paid for her daughter's life. Admiral, her communications officer, said, "The provisional government of Helix 7 is requesting to speak with you." Elena nodded and activated the view screen. The being on the other end was insectoid, with compound eyes and mandibles that clicked nervously as it spoke. "Admiral Vasquez," it said, "on behalf of the Helix people, I wish to formally thank humanity for its support in our liberation." "You liberated yourselves," Elena replied. "We just showed you that it was possible." The Helix official bowed its head. "For 3,000 years, we believed that resistance to the Concord was futile, and we believed that their judgment was absolute, and we believed that we had no choice but to submit." It looked at her with those compound eyes. Then we saw a human mother throw herself over her child to protect her from beings who ruled the galaxy. And we saw a human father build a fleet to bring his family home. And we learned that we had been wrong about everything. Elena thought about Myra, now 18 years old and studying at the first Galactic Academy that welcomed humans. Her daughter had recovered from her ordeal in the restructuring center. Though the scars remained, she still woke sometimes from nightmares about the White Room and the psychologists who had tried to erase her mind. But she had survived. She had more than survived. She had become a symbol of everything the Concord feared about humanity. A child who refused to break, a girl who grew into a woman who would never submit. "Thank you for your kind words," Elena said to the Helix official. "But the work is not finished." "No," the official agreed. "The Concord still controls 8,000 worlds, but it controlled 10,000 when your family was judged. And every year that number grows smaller." After the call ended, Elena walked to her quarters and found David waiting for her. Her husband looked older than he had 10 years ago, with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes, but his hands were still steady, and his gaze was still sharp. Marcus, now 11, was doing homework in the corner of the room, occasionally asking his father for help with mathematics. "The Helix are free," Elena said, sitting down beside David. "I heard," he replied, taking her hand. "That makes 27 species in the last decade. 27 species who saw what we did and decided they did not have to accept the Concord's judgment." David was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever wonder if we did the right thing?" he asked Elena. Considered the question. They had threatened to destroy an entire world. They had built weapons capable of genocide. They had shown the galaxy that humanity could be just as terrible as any alien. Empire, when pushed far enough. I think about it every day, she admitted. But then I think about Myra in that restructuring center, and I think about my arm in a box. And I think about what they were going to do to our family. She squeezed his hand. And I know that I would do it all again. The door opened and Mira walked in. Her academy uniform slightly rumpled from a long day of classes. She had grown tall. With her mother's fierce eyes and her father's steady presence, the galaxy knew her face from the footage of her judgment. From the images of her screaming as guards dragged her away from her mother. But they also knew her as the girl who had refused to break. The child who had fought against alien technology with nothing but her own will. "Mom." "Dad," she said, flopping onto the couch. "My professor asked me to give a speech at the Liberation Day ceremony next month." "What did you say?" David asked. "I said I would think about it." "Because I do not like giving speeches." Elena smiled. "You should do it because people need to hear from you. And they need to see that you are not a symbol or a legend, but a real person who survived something terrible and kept going." Myra looked at her mother's metal arm. At the scars that peeked out from her uniform. "Did you ever get used to it?" she asked. "Being the admiral who threatened to destroy a world." "No," Elena said honestly. "And I hope I never do. Because the day I stop feeling the weight of that decision is the day I become as bad as the beings who judged you." She reached out and took her daughter's hand. "We showed the galaxy what humans are capable of when our families are threatened. And now we have to show them what else we are capable of." "Like what?" "Like mercy and compassion. And building something better than what came before." The family sat together in comfortable silence. 4 humans who had changed the course of galactic history. Outside the window, stars gleamed against the darkness. Thousands of worlds filled with species who had once believed that the Concord's judgment was absolute. Now they knew better. Now they knew that judgment could be challenged. Now they knew that even the oldest and most powerful empires could be made to fear. A few months later, a Concord diplomat visited human space to discuss terms for a possible peace treaty. He was ancient by the standards of his species, old enough to remember when the Concord had first begun judging other civilizations. He met with the Vasquez family on New Terra, the world where they had built their home after the rescue. David poured tea while Elena reviewed the proposed terms. Mira sat in the corner, pretending to read, but actually listening to every word. "I must ask," the diplomat said, "how did you do it? Because our analysts have studied your species for years and still cannot understand how you built a fleet capable of threatening us in less than a year." David handed him a cup of tea. "You made a mistake," he said. "What mistake?" "You thought that because we were small and young and weak by your standards, we were not dangerous, but we are not weak. And we are definitely dangerous." He sat down across from the diplomat. "We just save our strength for things that matter." The diplomat looked around the comfortable home, at the family photographs on the walls, at the children's drawings stuck to the refrigerator. "This," he said slowly, "this is what matters to you. Yes, family, and freedom. And the right to exist without being judged by beings who think they know better." The diplomat was quiet for a long moment. "In 12,000 years, he said finally, we have judged countless species, and many of them resisted. And all of them eventually submitted, because our power was too great and their will was too weak." He looked at Elena's metal arm, at the scars that she wore like badges of honor. "But you did not submit. And now species that we pacified millennia ago are rising up, and our empire is crumbling. And we cannot understand why." Elena leaned forward. "I can tell you why." The diplomat waited. "Because you forgot what it means to love something enough to die for it. And you forgot what it means to protect your children with everything you have. And you forgot that the most dangerous creature in the universe is not the strongest or smartest. She smiled. And there was no warmth in it. The most dangerous creature is the one who has nothing left to lose. The peace treaty was signed 3 months later. It was not perfect. And it did not solve all the problems between humanity and the Concord. But it was a beginning. And in homes across the galaxy, parents told their children the story of Elena Vasquez, who lost her arm to save her daughter. They told them about David Vasquez, who built a fleet on fury and spite. They told them about Myra Vasquez, who refused to break no matter what they did to her, and they told them the lesson that humanity had taught the galaxy. You do not touch their families. You do not threaten their children, because if you do, they will come for you with fire and fury, and they will never, ever stop in her home on New Terra. Elena Vasquez watched the sunset with her family and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in years. Peace, not the Concord's peace, which was just another word for submission, real peace. The kind that was earned through sacrifice and struggle. The kind that came from knowing your family was safe. She looked at David, at Myra, at Marcus, her family, the family she had protected with her own body, the family that had moved the galaxy to bring her home, and she knew that every scar, every sleepless night, every moment of cold fury had been worth it, because this was what humans fought for. This was why they never surrendered. This was the love that burned at the center of their violent, stubborn, beautiful species, and the galaxy would never forget it.